This is the Magnus Carlsen versus Giri, Norway Chess 2023. Nimzo-Indian classical variation. Understand that someone with good technique will deny his opponent counterplay, improve his position, and only then go for the kill. So the game started off with Magnus having the white pieces and Giri was playing the black side. D4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, queen c2, the classical variation. Now, black understandably wanted to gain a grip on central light squares, particularly the d5 and e4 squares. However, as chess players, it is important for us to always look for ways to improve our technique. You have a goal, you have a plan, but you want to improve your technique. It's not just what you do, but how you do it. So what I'm going to do from this point on throughout the video is consider alternatives for black. Castle King side. Now as you climb that chess ladder, you will need to start considering other alternatives or weighing your options. One of the main things I teach my assassins is to stir up complications. For instance, the d4 pawn is undefended for the moment. On b4 is attacked by the pawn on a3. Bishop takes c3 check. Queen takes c3. Now in the game, d5 was played. Now this move is premature in my opinion. In the Nimzo-Indian, I prefer to use prophylaxis. Prophylaxis is prevention, or in other words, stopping your opponent's plans before proceeding with your own. Now you can preserve the option of playing d5 later. For instance, after queen takes c3 and now b6. You now have ideas of either placing the bishop on b7, controlling the a8 to h1 diagonal, or you could place the bishop on a6, perhaps, aiming for the c4 pawn. And after bishop f4, bishop b7. Now, two main choices for white here are e3 and knight f3. e3, a possible continuation, is d6. Now notice how the bishop on f4 and the queen on c3 x-rays the pawn on c7. f3, rook e8, knight e2, and now play d5. Although the pawn is being attacked twice now, knight takes d5, protects the pawn on c7, but it also forks the bishop and the queen. The other line is knight f3. A possible continuation is d6, e3, knight b d7, bishop d3, queen e7. The idea is to get all the pieces developed quickly and push the pawn to e5. Castle, rook on a to e8, bishop g3, e5. Now by white's bishop sitting on g3, black can simply play knight h5 with the intent to remove that bishop. D takes e5, d takes e5. And although three pieces attack the pawn on e5, yet black's three pieces defend the pawn. Bishop f5, knight e4. So this is the advantage of placing the bishop on b7. Now you get to exploit the e4 square. Bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, and black is slightly better here. Now let's say if white does not take the pawn. After e5, instead white plays knight d2. Knight h5, and white's bishop is restrained. Okay, going back. So in the game, instead of b6, black played d5. E takes d5, knight e4, queen c2, e takes d5, bishop f4, and in the game, bishop f5 was played. Another move to consider here is rook e8, centralizing the rook so that after queen takes c7, queen h4, g3, queen f6, f3, knight a6, queen c1, queen takes d4. Now the d4 pawn is always a target in such positions for black. e3, knight c5, exploiting the fact that the king still sits in the center on e1 and the pawn is pinned to the king. King f2, queen f6, and black's pieces are very active. Now he can just develop the bishop, the light square bishop on c8 here, and the rooks will be connected. But in the game, bishop f5 was played. Queen takes c7, queen takes c7. Bishop takes c7 and rook c8. Bishop to f4. White's got one piece occupying the diagonal, the H2 to B8 diagonal. Black has two pieces centralized, in addition to a rook on an open file on C8. Lastly, the D4 pawn is a target. What Black needs to do is to take into account all of these factors. Therefore, knight C6, attacking the pawn on D4. And after F3, the game continues. Knight F6, G4, bishop to G6. And notice how Black's pieces are developed and the rooks are connected. H4, knight takes D4, threatening to fork the king and rook on C2. Rook D1, knight B3, H5, bishop C2, and the rook is trapped. The bishop attacks B1, D1, and the knight has D2, C1, A1, D4. All those squares are covered by both the bishop and the knight. Taking it back. But in the game, rook C2 was played. Another move to consider here is knight C6, attacking the pawn. But after rook C2, F3, knight F6, G4. Now let's examine this position. White still has pieces on the back row, and the king still sits in the center. In addition to this, the pawn on E4 is isolated. The pawn on D4 is isolated. For the moment, or undefended rather. Therefore, the bishop on G6 should definitely be considered here, allowing the potential rook C1. So, for example, bishop G6 and rook C1. The bishop on F1 is still closed in. The king still sits in the center on E1. The pawn on D4 is vulnerable to attack, so knight C6, and after rook C2, bishop takes E2, king D2, bishop G6. Now white has to protect the D pawn. However, white is behind in development, and therefore knight takes G4. Do you see why black can capture this pawn? One move It's 92. But what happens if white captures the knight on g4? Pawn takes g4. And after bishop e4, white has to return the material. Knight takes g4. And after 92, knight f6. Going back. In the game, bishop to e6 was played. And the game continued, rook b1. Knight c6, e3, knight a5, bishop d3, rook c6, knight e2, knight c4. King f2, rook on a to c8, rook on h to c1, b5, bishop takes c4, b takes c4, and b4. Capturing en passant, rook takes c6, rook takes c6, rook takes b3, and rook b6 was played. h5 was another move to consider. Pawn to g5, knight d7, rook b7, rook c2, and the idea is for black to put up some kind of resistance. King e1, rook a2, rook takes a7, rook a1 check, king f2, rook a2, bishop c7, bishop h3, rook a8, king h7, rook a5, rook c2, bishop d6, knight b6, going for the c4 square. The other move is h6, and the line continues. Rook to b8 check, king h7, rook b7, a6, h3, knight d7. Joining the rook in the action. Bishop e5, etc. But in the game, rook b6 was played, and the game continued. Rook takes b6, a takes b6, knight c3, h5, g takes h5, king h7, bishop c7, knight d7, king g3. And after this move, black conceded the game to white. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for my next video.